Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Today, we are reviewing a new book, Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. Many ways, it's a really timely book. Delves into some of the most significant issues relating to the Palestinian organization and movement, especially given now that President Trump's administration is also negotiating with the group as well. I wanted to bring in the authors, one of the authors of the book, to discuss the book itself and some of the controversies around it. So I'm really honored to be joined by Helena Cobban. Helena is the co-editor of the book with Rami G. Khoury. Helena, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you. I'll just correct you on one little thing. I'm not the co-editor, I'm the co-author because, Rami and I, we have an authorial voice there, although a lot of the book consists of both of us being veteran reporters, reporting on these interviews that we had conducted back in May of last year with a number of experts on Hamas. So it has a sort of an authorial voice, but it also, carries the full text, virtually full text of these interviews.
Thank you for that clarification. And you, of course, have written several other books, including the Palestine Liberation Organization, among many, many other books. So, you do have an authoritative voice on this, and I'm glad that you've joined us for this conversation. And I wanted to begin by just noticing the fact that a number of books have been published over the past few months, really, personal reflections on Gaza, and some of them have been really touching, from my analysis. A book by The World After Gaza by Pankaj Mishra. That was an amazing book. There was another book has been published by Omar Al-Akkad, One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This. And it's really a personal reflections on why he believes everyone in the world, just as everyone is against the apartheid in South Africa, will also one day realize that they too are against the genocide in Gaza. So that was another fascinating book. Another was by Peter Beinart, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. And yours is, of course, takes a slightly different tone, which is it's more of a political book, historical account of Hamas and why it's many ways have been misunderstood. So I wanted to first ask you a question about the origins of the book. How did that come about?
So I've played many roles in my life as a journalist and researcher and writer, and I have a publishing company called Just World Books, but I'm also the head of a small, very feisty nonprofit educational foundation based in the United States called Just World Educational. And so at our board meeting back in March of last year, we were discussing what our intervention, our best intervention on Gaza could be. And of course, has been a lot of very fine humanitarian reporting, primarily by Gaza Palestinians themselves. That has come out, and some of which I have also published in the past. I published Rifat al-Ariyad's first book, Gaza Writes Back, in my role as a publisher. But we decided that you need a political intervention. I mean, you can agonize, you can tear your hair, you can weep and scream about the humanitarian disaster, but this needs to be resolved in a political, diplomatic way. I mean, it's very similar to for example, the Rwanda genocide. There were people in Uganda downstream from Rwanda at the time picking the dead bodies out of the river and giving them a decent burial. And well-meaning Western liberals came and said, "Oh, how can we help you in your efforts?" And the Ugandans said, "Stop the goddamn genocide." That's how you end the humanitarian disaster. And this requires a political diplomatic initiative. So we decided to take on the matter of Hamas and the many ways it had been systematically demonized. Nobody knows exactly what happened on October 7th, 2023. But there's a heck of a lot of deliberate disinformation, not just misinformation. But, the story of the 40 beheaded babies that President Biden retold and retold. And he said, I've seen pictures of the beheaded babies. Nobody has evidence of 40 beheaded babies. Or the gang mass rapes of women in southern Israel by Hamas fighters on that day. Another claim. These kind of claims, honestly, are, number one, very frequently adduced by the warmongers. You go back to the First World War when the British media were full of claims of, oh, the Germans have been raping Belgian nuns, or like at the beginning of the Iran-Iraq war, the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter in the United States came in and said, oh, the Iraqis have been emptying the incubators from the babies. And these kind of atrocity claims are very frequently used to back up war.
Yeah, and on that point, I think I watching the Al Jazeera videos, a number of other videos, I think I have fallen in the position that Israel, if it was sincere, it could have simply said that, yes, Hamas committed war crimes. You could make that argument. They did not need to peddle atrocity propaganda in the way that they did. And as soon as they started doing that with the 40 beheaded babies and other propaganda lines that was trotted out, you knew this was really the beginning of an effort to mount to create global support for a genocide. That was, of course, the main purpose of those atrocity propaganda. So, but on October 7th, I'm wondering whether does your book shed any light as to whether why Hamas may have engaged in the October 7th attack? What was the main drivers for that? Does your book cover that?
So I can explain how we put the book together. This project actually did not start out as a book. It started out as a series of webinars. My fellow board member at Just World Educational, the very distinguished Palestinian, Jordanian, I think he's also American, journalist and former editor of the Jordan Times, Rami G. Khoury, and I agreed to co-host a series of webinars, which we held in May of last year, with experts on Hamas. Now, both Rami and I have done, not trivial amounts of reporting and interviewing, and in my case, researching with Hamas leaders and participants and activists at various levels in the organization, as well as with, anti-Hamas people at various levels. So we both felt we had a feel for it, but we're not experts. So we brought in 5 well-known experts on the organization, 4 of whom have published 1 or more books specifically about Hamas. And we had this series of weekly webinars with these experts, 3 of whom were Palestinians and 2 of whom were Europeans, people who really have delved into the organization's history, the way it makes decisions, the relationship between the political and military wings of the organization, very important questions. We wanted to have these discussions for a general, non-specialist public. And then we made transcripts, and many people said, gee, you should publish those transcripts as a book. And I looked through them. I thought, yeah, we can do this, and I do know something about book publishing. So it was really a natural progression. My company, Just World Books, did not publish this book because our business model, it takes a longer turnaround time to get from a manuscript to a published work. But luckily, I do have good friends at OR Books. That's OR Books, which publishes books both in London and in New York City. And their whole business model is based on a very speedy turnaround time. So I talked with my friends there, and they agreed to publish the book. And we agreed on the title of the book is the same as the title of the project, the webinar series, Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. So that there refers to the understanding. It matters that we understand Hamas, because that's the way that we're going to get the kind of negotiation that indeed President Trump's envoy, Adam Bueller, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name.
That's right.
That he has been pursuing. He's obviously, through his, I guess, repeated contacts with Hamas leaders in Qatar, figured out that there is this relationship between the political and the military wings, and we've seen, the discipline with which the Hamas Al-Qassam Brigade's fighters on the ground have adhered to the ceasefire, things like that. You can see you need to understand better this relationship between the different portions of the movement. So that's the origin of the book. We put together the 5 transcripts, which have, because it was a webinar, they have a very sort of conversational tone, which I think helps to make it accessible to non-specialists. And that is part of our goal, so that the broad public can get a broader and better understanding of what Hamas is, the Islamic resistance movement, how it relates to its religious origins, how that informs many of its actions, its relationship also with non-Muslim Palestinians, like, for example, Rami Khouri, who is a Palestinian Christian from Nazareth. But there are many other Palestinian movements and leaders who are not explicitly Islamist, but Hamas works with them, with, for example, the blatantly secularist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a whole broad range. So that was our goal, to present these 5 conversations to draw readers in. And then we also provided at the back, and actually at the beginning we have a little timeline, and then at the back we have quite a lot of material, the documentation. There's a list of the major, what you would call in when I was in school, dramatis personae, which is the major people who get talked about, and a glossary and a bibliography, so that people who want to really delve deeper can do that. And the documentation also includes the Hamas substantial excerpts from the Hamas Charter of 88, and then the revised Hamas document of 2017. So somebody who really wants to can compare the two documents on their own. That's the pitch for the book. Sorry.
Of course, that's perfect. And the title, Understanding Hamas, of course, presumes that the organization, the group, has been misunderstood in some way. So what are the key misunderstandings that people have about Hamas? Can you just go through some of the key arguments about how Hamas has been misunderstood? And we can get to the consequence of that misunderstanding, I guess, later on. But let's begin with some of the key core misunderstandings about Hamas that you think has been deadly in terms of Western engagement with the organization.
Good question. I think we're talking about sort of 2 parallel things here. We're talking about misunderstanding, and we're talking about deliberate misrepresentation, which has led to the misunderstanding. And so misunderstandings, many people in my own family here in the UK, where I grew up, still, maybe to this day, think that Hamas and ISIS are the same thing. And that's actually something we took on in the second one of our conversations, because, of course, nobody can support, nobody that I would want to talk to can support the atrocities committed by ISIS, beheading of Christians and people who were not their kind of Muslims, beheading of Yazidis, torture of people, disruption of whole communities. But, when people in the West hear, Hamas, they often think ISIS. No, the 2 organizations are very different. And for me, as a professional woman, the way that the 2 organizations treat women and think of their correct role in society, very different. When I was doing some reporting in Gaza in 2006, right after the elections in which Hamas took part and won, and that's another, misunderstanding, if you like. People don't know that history. I interviewed a lot of women in Hamas, including two of the elected women MPs who had run on the party's platform. And you see, and one of them later, Dr. Jamila Shanti, became a minister in the Hamas government, and the Israelis killed her, which is very painful. But I saw women running projects at all levels for Hamas. You do not see that with ISIS. So that's one little difference. And, in the book, we go into many of the differences between the two. Another misunderstanding / misrepresentation of Hamas is that they are, well, of course, they're just evil or they are just addicted to violence. And that has to do, with the beheaded babies and whatever. Many of those atrocity claims have been described by some people as this is a confession of what the Israelis themselves have done, and then they're projecting it onto Hamas. I don't think it's so much a confession as a statement of intent. If you're talking about, beheading babies, how many babies in Gaza have been beheaded and burnt alive and otherwise killed by the Israelis as a result, as part of their genocide in Gaza that resulted, that the Israelis launched in response to the events of October 7th. So, and the same with the mass rapes. I mean, we hear these accounts, horrifying accounts, actually authenticated by Israeli prosecutors that prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, including doctors in Israeli detention facilities, have been subjected to the most brutal forms of rape. So, those atrocity claims that came, first of all, from some Israeli organizations, Israeli government bodies, and then were picked up by the media, the corporate media in the West, and by political leaders in the West, including President Biden. They act as kind of permission, because Hamas did these horrible things to us. Therefore, we are quite entitled to do equally horrible things to them. So misunderstandings about Hamas, there are so many.
And it's interesting. The first example you gave is a good one, where there's a deliberate attempt to equate Hamas with ISIS, and that's one of the Israeli propaganda lines: Hamas is ISIS, ISIS is Hamas, and the two are, as you clearly pointed out, very different. ISIS is a transnational jihadi organization. Hamas is not a transnational jihadi group. It's a resistance organization, as many would describe. And over the years, they have adapted their charter and their positions. And some of the clear examples is initially, with the group being founded the way it was, there was an attempt. There was certain issues with the language, for example, not distinguishing between Jews and Zionism. There's a clear understanding and evolution of the group in the understanding who exactly they are fighting, and as a result of that, they amended their charter in 2017. So, do you want to talk a bit about that and why? Because many point to the Hamas charter and say, "Oh, Hamas just wants to kill Jews," and I think that's not really what Hamas is trying to do. Hamas is trying to oppose Israel's ongoing expansion and its fight really within historic Palestine. And it's not like some of the other organizations we mentioned. It's not a transnational political jihadi organizations. It's far from the. If anything, Hamas fought ISIS within Gaza and prevented the ISIS group from taking root within Gaza. So without Hamas, I think ISIS would have had a much stronger influence within Gaza itself. So I just wanted to get your comments on those points.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. Obviously, Hamas grew up in the bosom of the Palestinian resistance movement within the occupied territories, within the territories occupied in 1967. So it's very strong both in Gaza and in the West Bank. Interestingly, some of the survey data that's been done has said that it's consistently had a stronger position in society in the West Bank than in Gaza. But so in Gaza, my first book, the one you mentioned on the Palestinian Liberation Organization, I identified at that point that Gaza has really been the crucible of the Palestinian national liberation movement in the modern era from 1948 onwards. And why Gaza? Gaza, because that is where you have the largest concentration of Palestinian refugees from 1948 who are still living in the ancestral homeland of Palestine. So it's a very nationalist, concentrated and highly motivated population there. So Gaza was where Fatah got its origins. And Gaza has always been sort of continuing to be the incubator of the Palestinian liberation movement. So Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was the founder of Hamas, was he did all his work. He grew up in Gaza, and he founded Hamas there. Originally, it was the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood organization, but it was definitely the Palestinian branch of the organization. They didn't take orders from anywhere else. It was, as you say, it was not a transnational thing. And then after the first Intifada broke out, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and his colleagues decided we have to join this explicitly political movement. Until then, they had been more focused on kind of trying to stabilize Palestinian life in the terrible situation of the Israeli military occupation, and to strengthen Palestinian family life, and to ensure that people were more sort of pious. But in December of 1987, they said we have to actually join the political struggle alongside all the more secular nationalist groups, and they did. They played a great role in the first Intifada, then in the second Intifada, and so the covenant was actually adopted or propounded in, I think, August of 1988, shortly after the declaration, the founding of Hamas in December 1987. And as some people say, actually, it was never adopted by the core leadership of Hamas, all of whom were in jail, or most of whom were in jail at that point in 1988. But I think Dr. Azam Tamimi, who was one of the guest experts on our webinar, he said it was just essentially some random school teacher in a refugee camp pulled together this 1988 document. And then Hamas didn't feel able to either disavow it or change it or edit it until they had a very thorough consultation. And that is one of the key aspects of Hamas's internal politics, that it's very consultative amongst all the major branches of the movement which exist in Gaza, the West Bank, the diaspora, and crucially in the amongst the Palestinians in Israeli prisons. So those all were consulted in and what came out in 2017. So that's like a time lag of around 30 years that I'm thinking about. They really feel that this is, what they can all stand by and stand for, and it makes very interesting moves regarding, for example, the two-state solution. They're still not 100% behind the two-state solution, which, in my view, is the only thing that has international diplomatic traction these days. But we don't need to discuss that because I'm not Palestinian. I don't get a vote on this matter. But so what they said in 2017 is that something to the effect that though our preference is, for a single Islamic state in the whole of historic Palestine, if the majority of the Palestinian people are happy with a proposal for a two-state situation, then we will support that.
Yeah.
which is really a fascinating negotiating position. And it's a negotiating position on the basis of which they can, have much more productive and constructive discussions with the leaders of Fatah and also with the international community, when their envoys go to Beijing or the Soviet Union or other BRICS countries and talk about how you're going to get a diplomatic resolution of this.
I wanted to ask you about the timing. It seems that you've preempted the current mood in global politics because the Trump administration, as we know, is negotiating with Hamas over the head of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which is an extraordinary development if you think about it, with so much demonization of the group that we've seen over the decades, that Trump is willing to negotiate with Hamas. And that, of course, comes on, I would say, on the back of a trend in Europe, which the Israelis have sought to suppress. I remember Tony Blair many years ago saying that it was a huge mistake, or he regrets that it was a huge mistake to marginalize Hamas after the 2007-6 election. So he says it was a clear mistake. And also, MEMO held a conference a few years back. Jack Straw, who was his foreign secretary at the time, he also mentioned something to the effect that it was a mistake, and his insistence on trying to engage with Hamas was probably one of the reasons why he was dismissed. So there has been a recognition within Western governments that you need to engage with this organization, but because of the lobbying and the campaigning of the Israelis, it's been very, very difficult. So I think your book has kind of preempted a mood which we are seeing being played out currently now in Washington, reaching out to Hamas and trying to engage and negotiate with Hamas. So how do you think, what do you think of that attempt by President Trump to reach out and engage with Hamas over the heads of Benjamin Netanyahu, it seems, because they are not very happy with that?
So the quote from Trump's special envoy, Adam Buehler, if that's how you say it, that I really liked was when he said, the United States is not the agent of Israel. I mean, you would never have heard President Biden say that. I mean, that's such a breath of fresh air. Of course, we don't know. Trump is so unpredictable. We don't know whether this will lead to anything or whether somebody else will get Trump's ear. But I would say that Adam Buehler actually has a long track record with Trump. He was very active as an emissary in the first Trump administration, including doing the negotiations with the Taliban that were really important back in, I want to say, 2020. So I think Trump is going to take him pretty seriously. What is interesting to me is that as there are these, well, really, it's just Trump. I mean, I haven't seen Keir Starmer making any overtures toward Hamas. In fact, there's this kind of, they have all this anti-terror legislation that is already, well, it's still going strong and may, anyway, nobody apart from Trump, let me say, has really done anything like what Trump has done to reach out to Hamas leaders and say, we need to investigate this possibility. But of course, as you mentioned, it's driven the Israelis absolutely bonkers. And at the same time, although Trump has made this really interesting overture, the corporate media, both in the United States and here in the UK, is still in overdrive on their attempt to keep Hamas demonized. I mean, everything that's going wrong in the negotiations is blamed on Hamas. Actually, it's the Israelis that walked away from the ceasefire negotiations. It's the Israelis that tried to completely recast the terms of the negotiation. It's the Israelis who have been on a daily and systematic basis violating the terms of the ceasefire that was agreed on January 15th and started implementing on January 19th. So, and the mainstream media just follows along. I mean, you know, this evening, well, it's Monday when we're talking. I'm due to be speaking at the London School of Economics with Dr. Jeroen Gunning, and who is one of the contributors to our book, Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters, a really excellent expert on Hamas. And Moin Rabbani from Canada is coming in by Zoom, and a couple of other people also speaking at this event. And the Israeli ambassador here has gone batshit crazy, honestly. You know, threatening LSE that, you know, oh, the Jewish students don't feel safe and I don't know what else. You know, this just very lazy campaign to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. I mean, this stuff is so old. And
on the LSE thing, we covered this, and there's been a number of reports about the event, and it's just a book launch at the end of the day at a UK university. But there's been a lot of misrepresentation, not of Hamas, but also you, Helena, you and your co-author as well, about your motives, I guess. So the misrepresentation isn't just of Hamas, or anyone who is trying to present Hamas in a different light. So what are the key ways that you've been misrepresented? I know you want to. You have a number of. You want to get things off your. I would say set the record straight. You know. So what are the ways that you've been misrepresented, and also your co-author?
Well, you know, both of us have been misrepresented as anti-Semites, which, you know, that's the very lazy accusation that people launch. I mean, in my case, it's ridiculous. It's patently ridiculous. I actually hand sewed the prayer shawl for my 13-year-old granddaughter for her to have her bat mitzvah. You know, our whole family supported her in doing this. And I mean, it's trite to say I have so many Jewish friends, but I have so many Jewish comrades, you know, in the struggle for Palestinian liberation over the decades. For me, this is not new at all. When my book on the Palestinian Liberation Organization came out, it was exactly the same, you know, that I got accused of all kinds of things because I dared to say that, you know, maybe people should look at the politics of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in a calm and fact-based way, so that they can understand, you know, what the possibilities are for negotiation. And it took a while, but eventually there was a negotiation. And I'm very proud that that book helped to contribute, you know, a whole fund of knowledge along with other books to the decision makers that decided to engage with the PLO at the time. And in essence, I think I want to do the same with this book, although it's not, you know, it's more like a collection of interviews that Rami and I did. So I was reading in the Daily Telegraph yesterday and in the Times today, where the reporters there, and last week, the education editor of the London Times did an initial report on the controversy over our book launch, in which she misspelled my name. I mean, you know, an education editor like can't get something as basic as that, right? So that does kind of tell you that there's a degradation of journalistic standards. You know, I started out my journalism career working for Reuters, the London Sunday Times, and the Christian Science Monitor, three very fine journalistic enterprises. And there was actually a really interesting article in the Sunday Times magazine yesterday about an incident that I was involved in, you know, when David Holden was killed in a Times reporter, Sunday Times reporter in the Middle East back in 1977. So, you know, Rami and I both have long histories as journalists. So yesterday in the Daily Telegraph and today in the Times, the reporter writes, you know, that the book claims that, okay, hang on, this is the exact excerpt. They say the book, says this: Israeli claims about what happened on the 7th of October have since been proven to be false. Well, if they had actually looked at the book rather than, just take the handout from the Israeli embassy, they would have seen that that little portion of the book, where is it? Okay, it's over here, I think, is Rami and me as reporters representing, recording, reporting on the views of one of our interviewees. So these like reporters now in the Daily Telegraph and the Times aren't even doing their basic, like, okay, in what context was this quote brought up? Oh, goodness, it's in the context of Helena and Rami reporting on something that they were told. So any
even then, is that really what you just said? I don't see how that's untrue. I mean, the Israeli claims have been debunked even by their own investigations. They found Netanyahu to have been incompetent. The latest one found that Netanyahu's policies led to 7th October. The week before, there was an investigation, and the IDF concluded that yes, the controversial Hannibal Directive was issued. So, but none of this is, of course, being covered by Western media. But Israelis have their investigations have probed and concluded things which would never get reported here. It seems as though in the West, in the media, right-wing media, holding on to the propaganda line is way more important than some of the Israeli outlets like Haaretz and many others who are openly saying that the government made mistakes. They did issue the Hannibal Directive. They are questioning some of the other claims. But here in the West, holding the line on propaganda is being seen as being way more important than over there. Sorry to interject, but yeah, I just want to get that point in.
No, I completely agree with you. And of course, there has been the interesting Israeli military report last week into what the IDF's report into what happened on October 7th and in the lead up to it. There has never been a comprehensive investigation, that takes in both the military and the kind of security intelligence and the political decision making on the Israeli side. And actually, I think calling for an impartial investigation is very important in the international community, and that would look at both sides, that look at all sides, because undoubtedly there were violations of international humanitarian law on October 7th. Who committed them? We don't know. What we do know is that the Hamas fighting units had a very specific goal, which was to capture the Gaza Brigade headquarters and the Southern Command headquarters of the Israeli military, the IDF. Those are valid military targets. But there were also a lot of, non-valid targets, non-military targets, non-combatant targets that were destroyed or violated, or people who were non-combatants who were killed. Who did it? We don't know. That's why we need the impartial investigation. There were obviously the Hamas units that came out. There were many other fighting units, some of them that came out once the walls had been breached of the concentration camp of Gaza. Some of these Gaza clans, which have arms, they came out. Individual kind of Gaza families came out. Some of them, were just sort of looting or doing whatever. All of that is a violation of international humanitarian law, by the way. Just as when the Israelis loot in Gaza, that's a violation of international humanitarian law. There were the mass burnings of those cars near and around the music festival, which were almost certainly done by the Israeli Air Force under the Hannibal Doctrine that you mentioned. And the Israeli media themselves have done some investigations into the use of the Hannibal Doctrine in some of the Israeli settlements there. So, all of that stuff needs to be investigated. And meantime, the corporate media here just, maybe some of them have let go of the beheaded babies, and they still cling on to the claims about mass rapes. But they also blithely say that, Hamas or Hamas-led fighters killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7th. Whereas, we know from the Israeli media, and you're right to point out the contrast between the two. We know from the Israeli media that many of the people who were killed, the civilians, were killed by Israeli military action under the Hannibal Doctrine. So, and we also know now that the number of people killed on that day was less than 1,200. So this claim that Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7th is just parroted again and again and again in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Times of London, in all these big, and I'm sure in continental European media as well.
I mean, the way I look at the manner in which Israel presents these claims, it's almost like people who believe in God will say something like, the absence of evidence is not evidence of his absence. So they use that with regards to crimes committed by Hamas. Just because we don't have evidence doesn't mean the crime did not take place. This is like absence of evidence is not absence of the fact that this crime did not take place. You can't use that argument, but that's the realm of their discourse. They're bringing in points which have a manner of arguing which have no real validity. That's not how you judge where the crimes take place or not. But this is the way they engage, and many people have seen through that now, and which is why I think that in the long run, it does will have a backlash, because if they don't have confidence in your narrative, the whole narrative collapses, and Israel, more than anything else, needs its Western audience to believe in the Zionist project. It's not like, for example, Qatar or Saudi Arabia, who is dependent on a Western narrative about Israel's exceptionalism and its need to survive. Saudi doesn't need that. Qatar doesn't need that. Egypt doesn't need that. Whereas Israel needs that narrative of this small country fighting against barbarians, and it needs Western support. And it's a democracy in the Middle East. And that narrative is collapsing, partly because of their own failure to deal with 7 October in an honest manner. And so much propaganda has been unleashed that people just don't believe what the Israelis are saying anymore. And I think the impact will be very lasting, and we are seeing that now. I wanted to end though by just talking about today's event. I know you have to leave this, and I'm sure you need to prepare. So what's the situation now currently? So the LSE University has agreed to host the event. I know they've come under a lot of pressure. So that raises a whole new question about academic freedom. We are seeing in the US where President Trump has withdrawn $400 million from one of the universities, George Washington, I think one of the universities, Columbia University. And we're seeing something here where universities are under a lot of pressure to toe the line when it comes to Israel-Palestine. But LSE seems to have held their ground, and they are going ahead with the event. So is that still the case? They are going ahead?
Yes, I definitely want to give a shout out to Vice Chancellor Larry Kramer of LSE, who I'm sure was the person who at the end of the day had to make the decision as to whether this would go ahead or not. And he has stood quite firm in support of academic freedom for, it's being organized by primarily Professor Dr. Jeroen Gunning, who is a professor at LSE, and he was one of our guest experts. And he's pulled together a really wonderful panel. I'm just one of 4 speakers. Of course, LSE has come under this ridiculous assault led by the Israeli ambassador here in London, who has said that it will make Jewish students feel unsafe. And thus far, as I say, it's great that Vice Chancellor Kramer has stood firm. I also did an event at SOAS last week that was a wonderful discussion, and I think it's going to be online soon. So I'm confident that we can do this, but I think LSE did come under they had felt to be under such a high degree of threat that they have limited the event only to members of the LSE community, that is, people who are staff or students at LSE, for the live event. And that may be a very wise thing, because it means that outside agitators from the pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist hard right will not be, there in droves. I mean, maybe some of the members of the LSE community are very pro-Israeli, and they will be given a chance to speak and to ask questions, of course. That's my understanding. But anybody else who wants to see the event will have to see it on Zoom, and can also, I think, interact with us via Zoom to a limited extent. So that's great. And that is, as you say, in notable contrast to what's happening in US universities, where it's not only, the federal government withdrawing funding from Columbia, but also the universities have come under major threat from their donors. And they've been forced, many universities, as well as other institutions in the States, have been forced to accept and use this International Holocaust Remembrance Association. The definition of the IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism, that includes that, criticism of the actions of the Israeli government can frequently constitute anti-Semitism. So to me, it's very troubling that universities over there in the States are not prepared to stand for academic freedom, including because in the United States, we have this thing called the First Amendment, which is, a guarantee of free speech. And we have other actually constitutional protections that don't exist here in this country under the counter-terror legislation. For example, in the States, there's a constitutional protection against excessive search and seizure of your possessions. There's a constitutional protection that allows anybody to remain silent. So there's the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution. And those things do not exist here. You cannot remain silent if you're under arrest. I'm very concerned about that, of course. Going back to the universities in the States, trouble is, a lot of these universities have become kind of recruitment arms for the high finance industry. So the people who sit on their boards are these, very wealthy financiers, and the budgets that they have for these kind of training camps for their, little financial capitalists in training, which is, a caricature, I realize. I know that universities do a lot of other things, but many of them have become much more focused on training people for the financial industry, let us say. But the funding of these universities is massive. So Columbia University, for example, has an endowment of $5 billion. So the federal government withdrawing $400 million, it's a bunch of money. But it's only, 8% of the budget or of the endowment. I think it's actually much less in terms of a proportion of, because it's a multi-year, the 400 million is a multi-year grant. But so the university, it's academic freedom in the universities comes under threat, not just from the Trump administration, but also from the very wealthy people who sit on the boards. I guess that's what I want to say about it.
Mm. And it wouldn't be a principle if it wasn't worth defending. So academic freedom, if Columbia really is for academic freedom and they have so much money to fall back on, why wouldn't you defend that principle? Principle isn't a principle unless you are willing to sacrifice something. So on free speech, we're seeing how this the amendment has been tarnished and ripped apart, and it's all to the detriment not just of the pro-Palestinian organizations, but in the end, Americans themselves. There's a reason why those protections exist. But anyway, I mean, our conversation will come out after your event in LSC. So if the video does come out before our conversation is published, we will put a link to that, so our viewers can also watch your event in LSC. And for our viewers who want to read the book, how can they purchase the book? Where can they purchase it from?
So you can purchase it from all major retailers in this country, including online retailers. You should be able to get it from your bookstore. And what I would actually urge is that you request it at your bookstore or library, and that they actually get a hold of a copy. They may not have copies in the bookstore on the shelves at the time, but if they get enough people going into Waterstones or wherever, to ask for the book, then they will start to stock it. And failing that, you can buy it directly from the publisher, All Books, OR Books, and I think you can give people the QR code that will enable them to do that. And the book is available both in the United Kingdom, the United States, and I think in most other countries via the All Books website.
Mm. Thank you, Helena, and good luck with your event this evening. Thank you for joining the conversation with the Middle East Monitor, and those who have tuned in, thank you also. See you for another conversation with MEMO soon. Bye-bye.